My name is Reverend Yearwood, and I am the president of the Black Caucus, Congressman John Conyers. Today we will begin a much-needed conversation on the jobs crisis, growth, inequality, and full employment. Let me also say this too. One of the things that I think is very important for me now, while I am the president of the Hip Hop Caucus, today I'm going to kind of, I'm going to wear my former Georgetown professor hat so we can get adequate to all the jobs and issues. But before I get into that hat, I want to put on my reverend hat and say this. When Congressman Conyers comes in, I need us to give him his flowers. Y'all know what I'm talking about? I need us to make a ruckus. I need us to just put aside our PhDs, our MDs, our JDs, whatever D you got, and just have about 2 minutes so that we can appreciate the legacy and the power of the man who is with us. I just want to say that. Somebody who was just commenting that has been around way before I was born, but has been with so many presidents, as the one who helped usher in this Congressional Black Caucus, who I know from talking with him, faced his own sort of racism when he was in Congress as a member of Congress. I can imagine through the years of him with Reagan and both Bush and Nixon and LBJ, Clinton, you name it, to be around in that process and still be functioning the way he is, and I believe it's 85 years old. It's simply amazing. So we're gonna definitely make sure and give him that honor. Y'all with that?
Yes.
Y'all gotta be with that. Y'all with
All
that?
right.
Okay. All right. Now again, put down about. It's okay. We know everybody look a little just a little excited for 2 minutes, but I'm sure he will appreciate that. So let me just get into this process we're going to get into. Let me just set and I can tell you now, we actually have a phenomenal panel before us, and this is a process. And I want to discuss some of the very important economic and political challenges that are facing our nation. These issues that many of us feel are not being effectively addressed by our elected officials and are not being highlighted in the national media, or being ignored by the American civil society in general. Let me just give you a few examples of the issues that millions of Americans are concerned with and strongly feel are not being addressed by our elected officials that we are going to address in this brain trust today. One, employment and low wages. A Gallup poll said that Americans believe that unemployment is America's #1 problem. We have approximately 14 million Americans who are out of work, and about 28 million Americans who are either unemployed, working part-time jobs, or have just given up looking for work altogether. We have millions of Americans who are working but still cannot afford housing, health care, food, or to pay their monthly bills. We have a president, President Barack Obama, who introduced a progressive and exciting direct jobs creation bill, the Americans Job Act, and a 21st century New Deal's job program, which would have put millions of Americans back to work, rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, airports, ports, underground water pipes, and public schools. But due to the partisanship that we have and right now that's going on in Congress, we also have the highest rates of unemployment since the Great Depression. And we're blocking many of these job bills simply for partisan reasons. Now, one of the things here is that the wonderful John Conyers has put forth his H.R. 1000, America's Job Act, and he has put forth that bill to make sure we have jobs for all. Now, the purpose of this brain trust is that we must begin the discussion about how we can make America a more moral, fair, and just nation for all people, and not be just bystanders and sit out on the sidelines of one of the world's greatest democracies. Now, I'll say this, and I see Chanel here from the Urban League. I say, Chanel, I am an optimist, and I truly believe that if we get organized and become unified politically and strategically, that we can turn our nation around and become a more just and sustainable sustainable, and fair nation for all Americans. So the purpose of this brain trust is to get people across the nation to wake up, to get excited, and begin to participate in the politics of our nation. There's a great book about hip-hop version involving politics. So we can lay on that. So we can create a more perfect union and achieve what Representative Conyers calls a, quote, citizens operating majority, end quote, where we, the people, the fourth branch of government, become engaged citizens and start moving America forward together so we can become one of the greatest democracies the world has ever seen. And with that, let me just go through the bios of everyone as we get ready to get started. So on the panel we have, most of you are dear friends or good friends in this project. We have Dr. Maya Rockmore, who is the President and CEO of Global Policy Solutions. So she will be presenting her OSD report on the racial and ethnic wealth gap. Dr. Maya Rockmore leads Global Policy Solutions, which is a Washington, D.C. based policy firm that makes policy work for people and their environments. She's a former adjunct professor in the Women in Politics Institute at American University. Maya has also served as the Vice President of Research and Programs at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, a Senior Resident Scholar at the National Urban League, Chief of Staff for Congressman Charles Rangel, and on the professional staff on the House Ways and Means Committee, and so many other things. I just want to, she is the author of some great books. You need to jot these down so you can know some of these are the one I mentioned earlier. She is the author of the Political Action Handbook, How to Get Folk Like Me for the Hip Hop Generation, and she is co-author. Thank you. And Congressman Conyers, to show you how much that we love you, I want folks to make sure that they know that when you came in, we were ready for you, and we want you just to know and appreciate all you have done for us as a people and our community. Congressman Conyers, if you're ready, I just want to have you folks to give your remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Reverend Dr. Hewlett, and look at this panel. Let's give them a round of applause for everybody here and ready to go. Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to an extraordinary legislative conference, again put on by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you and for joining with me in this panel on the jobs crisis that we are facing across this country, but in our black communities in particular. Like so many of you here, we begin this discussion with a restatement that employment is a human right. Employment is a human right. And with that in mind, we think the overriding priority in the Congress is elementary, getting this nation back to full employment, providing abundant jobs. I say getting it back to full employment. There are those that will point out we may not have ever had full employment except during World War II. And so it's getting to full employment. Providing abundant jobs and training is not just good ethics, but it's also good economics. And when every person's trained, working, earning a salary, contributing to our tax base, there are more customers for American goods and service. What does that mean? 1, less crime. 2, more government revenue. 3, a smaller national debt. And that means that less Americans will need government assistance, for which they should be provided, and that should even please conservatives who may not always agree with us on the importance of these issues. Most importantly, it means that workers have greater bargaining power and in turn higher wages. And that puts in a word of support for the idea of collective bargaining. Our unions have a right to represent working people. We can't expect people to negotiate with their employers one-on-one. We need a collective bargaining process that is strong and viable and workable. And so the challenge ahead of us is very large, because more than a half a decade after the financial crisis of 2008, there's still more than 20 million Americans seeking full-time work, and 7.5 million people working part-time that want to work full-time. And so we think that President Obama is on the right track, but we need to keep letting him know that we want him to do even more. There's still more than 2 applicants filing for every single job opening that exists. And that, unfortunately, tragically, doesn't include those millions who've given up on work because they can't find a job. They just surrender. And as a result, employers are not motivated to keep wages at a high and sustainable rate of compensation. And so I'm thrilled to have this phenomenal panel here. Thank you very much. To examine this problem, I know each of you have your own perspectives, and we want to hear the variety of solutions that are necessary. And then we want to get to the root of the problem that will lead to success. We need the political will to effectuate the great ideas that are going to be shared here. I close with the reminder that we have what I call my bill, the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Training Program, which derives off of what Hubert Humphrey and Gus Hawkins brought forward. It's H.R. 1000 with 57 co-sponsors to create full employment in this country. And it's based on a very tiny, small tax based on speculative transactions in Wall Street hedge funds, and will not add a dime to the federal debt. What an easy, brilliant way, we think, to move America forward toward a full employment economy. And I look forward to our economist, Phil Harvey, to provide details on this, and I thank you for your time. Reverend Yearwood, you're to be congratulated, and thank you all, panel. I look forward to your comments.
Okay, so let's thank you. Just give it one more time for Congressman John Connors. So I'm gonna run real quickly through the bios, and then so you can know who you have supported their excellence. And then I know Dr. Maya Rockmore, so I know she has to only leave after her remarks. So I want to make sure to get her important remarks, her report in here as well. But next up, so we have Valerie Wilson. Valerie, who is the program director. of Race, Ethnicity, and Economy at the Economic Policy Institute. Give it up for Valerie, y'all. Next up, as you heard before, we have Jared Bernstein. Jared, good to see you, my friend. He's a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And I just want to say, hey, just the Wikipedia, they have some phenomenal bios about, you can just go see all this stuff and all the good stuff on their background. Next we have Chanel Hardy, right here. Get over Chanel, y'all. The Executive Director and Senior Vice President for Policy for National Urban League. We'll say the Urban League we go to do our caucus for our job numbers and our job stats. So it's very important that we give our caucus perspective. Next up, we have Professor Philip Harvey. Professor of the Rutgers School of Law, and he will be presenting on actual Congress for Employment Bill HR 1000. And then we also have Keisha Bird. Good to see you. Keisha Bird is a senior policy analyst for the Center for Law and Social Policy. And then we also have, definitely, Tony Parrott. Tony Parrott is the Executive Director for the Metropolitan Sewer District of Greater Cincinnati. So, with that, Maya, since you have to, your time is there, so we want to get right to your presenting on your report on racial and ethnic, on the racial and ethnic wealth gap.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Lennox Yearwood. It's always a pleasure to be on stage with you. Congressman John Conyers is one of my personal heroes, ladies and gentlemen. He has basically been an advocate on all of the right issues, on the right policy for a very long time. But I think he has a lot of things to his credit, but one of the most important aspects of his character is his endurance. And when he first introduced the Martin Luther King holiday, it took 15 years before they got it adopted and passed into law. And it is now a part of our normal experience, right? So you might think that he might be on a chaotic quest to seek full employment, but I guarantee you he's on the right track. And it may take another 15 years for us to get to where we need to be, but the issue is that we cannot give up. And that is the point. Ladies and gentlemen, a full 50 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it is the case that the United States of America still maintains a racialized economic system. A racialized economic system. And nowhere are the effects of this racialized economic system more apparent than in our labor market, and nowhere more explicit than in our unemployment numbers. It is the case that African Americans, the unemployment rate for African Americans is always, not just after the Great Recession, is always double that of the white unemployment rate. Always. In fact, before the Great Recession, the African American unemployment rate was around 9%. When it became 9% for the general population, there was an outcry. But for us, it had been a crisis for a very long time. And so another area where we see the effects of not having good jobs, not having well-paying jobs, and not having jobs are in wealth disparities. And so earlier this year, my organization, the Center for Global Policy Solutions, released a new report. And that report is called Beyond Broke: Why Closing the Racial Wealth Gap is a Priority for National Economic Security. Now, I have no idea. Oh yeah, here we go. So that's the report. Go to our website, globalpolicysolutions.org, to read more about the report. But basically, folks, we're broke in many respects when you look at the effects in terms of what we have in wealth and assets. And our study actually shows that in terms of median liquid wealth. And liquid wealth is basically if you have access to cash or assets that are readily turned into cash easily. As of 2011, African Americans had a median liquid wealth of only $200, compared to $23,000 held by whites. And Latinos didn't fare much better with a median liquid wealth of only $340. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is with retirement funds included in the number. When you take retirement funds out of the analysis, the disparities in liquid wealth are even more disturbing. African Americans are found to hold a mere $25, and Latinos just $100 in liquid wealth compared to $3,000 held by the typical white household. Now, the fact of the matter is that it's very sad, and because we don't have cash or assets readily turned into cash, that means that we're literally living on the economic edge all the time. All the time. And that is why jobs and quality jobs and well-paying jobs and living wage and full employment policies are critically and vitally important for our communities. And the headliner in terms of our statistics that we found, and this was an analysis of the 2011 SIP data produced by the U.S. Census, is that for every $1 of wealth held by the typical white family, guess how much the typical African American family holds? 10 cents? Any other guesses?
Minus 10 cents. Negative 10.
It's actually 6 cents. For every $1 in wealth held by the typical white family, the typical African American family holds only 6 cents. The typical Latino family owns only 7 cents. Now that is, and we're 50 years beyond the civil rights era. Many of us think that we're making progress, but when you look at the disparities, you see how yawning these gaps are. Now, the effect of the Great Recession and the housing crisis had a disproportionately negative impact on our communities. When you look at between 2005 and 2009, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans collectively lost more than half of their net worth, compared to only 16% of whites. Now that is significant. Now while you see by 2011, they're starting to regain some of that net worth, the fact of the matter is that they're digging out of a deep hole. And now, when I say net worth, these are of the people who have wealth in our community. And for African Americans, most of that is tied up into our housing. In fact, about approximately 80% of the wealth that African Americans hold is connected to the housing market. And so, the fact of the matter is that when we are talking about issues of race in our society, race matters. Race matters in terms of wealth, it matters in terms of jobs, and get this, race is a greater predictor of wealth in our society than is class. You will have people, and I'll say these statistics and they'll say, oh, but everybody in poverty is the same. And the fact of the matter is that's not even true. The racial wealth gap actually exists at every level. When you parse out the income quintiles, the racial wealth gap exists at every level and is greatest at the lowest income quintiles. And so if you look at that first chart where you see the 0 and 7%, the 100, of low income poor whites, African Americans own 0 assets compared to low income poor whites. And Latinos own 7% of the assets owned by low-income poor whites. So we have a crisis, and the crisis is also reflected in these statistics. Now, wealth is different from income, and we're here today to talk about jobs and income. But the reason why there is a direct connection is because the kind of jobs you have, the quality of the income you receive, and what you do with that. You mean if you don't have enough income to put it in a retirement account, or to put it in a savings account, or to invest in a house, or to invest in a business per se, then what you're doing is basically you're setting up a structural and recurring issue where African Americans are perpetually in the cycle of poverty and living on edge. And so with that, we are very important. We think that job creation is incredibly important, but it's not just any job. It's not just any job, it's quality jobs. It's access to quality jobs with a living wage. It's access, we are so used to talking about gender pay disparities that we forget that we have racial pay disparities. And nobody's advocating, the second you mention race, they're saying, oh, you can't talk about race. But it's acceptable to talk about gender. And the fact of the matter is that and when gender intersects with race in class, then we're really talking about vulnerability. And so we need better and more jobs, more infrastructure investment, a federal jobs guarantee, full employment, making work pay and paying workers fairly. And we need to be explicit in our policies. By the way, there's a women's economic agenda. There's also a people of color and African American economic agenda. And we shouldn't be ashamed to push for it. Because as I mentioned, we have a racialized economic system, and because you have the confounding variables of income and race, with African Americans tending to be lower income in the lower income quintiles, we also have a racialized class system. So it's not sufficient. Don't be mad. Don't be afraid when people try to say that it's not appropriate to talk about race. It's completely appropriate. When they say that all we should be looking at is class, push back. And Mr. Conyers, you are absolutely on the right track, and I thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Maya. I know Maya was on fire there when she dropped down to hit the top of the laptop here. Ready to go. Thank you, Maya. Have a blessed one now. Moving in, so let's move right into our panel here. And I guess the first, based upon that, let me just say a quick comment on something that Maya said. There's two things I just wanted to say. One thing is the reason why policy is so important. It is critical. And it's important that we know that either we shape policy or policy will shape us. It's critical, so we have to understand that. And I think what was put forth here in regards to the race component of this aspect is that too long we are not at the table. That's why this is an important discussion to have today, because you must be at the table to have these conversations. And if I'm talking to you, Chanel, we say either you are at the table or you are on the menu. There is no in between. So, I want to just start with this, actually go down, and I would just say that we have one that I've learned about many years at CBC, but I have learned that this is a conversation that we can literally take the first row out of the audience and just put that up here, and they can literally miss a beat. Like this is usually my day when I was an Air Force officer, it feels like that when you can just look out and everybody is a leader. And so these are these kind of conversations. And so I want to make sure we have time to get in that kind of dialogue. Like literally go right here and we put it up here. So I was going to go ahead and get started with Chanel. You can just give your prepared remarks, or if you want to give some feedback onto what Maya said as a kind of precursor. Why won't Congress act on jobs? Does the weak job creation make progress on issues like immigration or climate change more difficult? And particularly, as we go into the last 2 years of President Obama, how should President Obama address the issue of jobs? And can he learn from FDR's approach?
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Yearwood. Before I start, I actually want to recognize one of the leaders in the audience. I'm privileged to work for the National Urban League, which is a 104-year-old organization focused on social and economic justice. And of course, the soldiers in the movement are the presidents and CEOs of our local affiliates, 95 across 36 states. We have one of our CEOs here, I believe. Is she still here? Did she walk out? All right, I wanted to recognize her. Well, Valerie Schultz-Wilson is here. She is the CEO of the Urban League of Southern Connecticut, and she has been doing excellent work in job training for many years. So if you see her around, there are a number of our CEOs around, it's a good conversation to have. I think In terms of the numbers, I think that we all know how bad it is, not only because we're pretty familiar with the statistics, but I bet if just by a show of hands I asked if you know someone who is unemployed or underemployed, what would that look like? Right. I mean, these issues are extremely personal. You know, I have a father who is a Navy veteran who struggles with employment. And as Valerie, who used to work for the National Urban League and is now directing a great initiative at EPI, one of the reports I remember reading there talked about how the unemployed African-American workforce is extremely experienced, extremely educated. That's not the issue. So just a few thoughts to contribute to the conversation. One is to go back to Maya's point about the history. Actually, the chief economic advisor of the National Urban League he is the professor emeritus at Wharton Business School, one of the top black economists in the country. And he was one of the people who was at the table when the original full employment bill, Humphrey Hawkins' full employment bill, was being developed. And what was interesting that he shared is that the impetus for the development of that bill was that the unemployment rate was at 6%. And as Maya said, the disparity, the black-white disparity, was 2 to 1. And last year, we actually did a 50-year retrospective of a number of black-white factors to see what the progress was since the last March on Washington for jobs and freedom, and found that no matter your experience, no matter where in the country you live, your gender, or your education, you are still twice as likely to be unemployed if you're black. And so we are dismayed that things are not changing the way we'd like to see them, but we are also committed, as Maya said, about Chairman Conyers, still Chairman, that
It's all right.
that we are committed to the fight for the long haul. So one of the things that we're doing in terms of talking about solutions is we launched an initiative called Jobs Rebuild America in May 2013, and we really put together all of the resources that we could gather from government funding, private sector funding, philanthropy, and focused on investments in job training for youth ages 16 to 24, mature workers ages 55 and up, preparing young people for college, developing a jobs network, and really supporting entrepreneurship. And through that, we've been able to, in the past 10 years, train, let me see if I can find my number. I think it is, we've been able to put almost 200,000 people in jobs. So obviously, we'd like to be able to have higher numbers, but it really reflects the realities in the country today. Also, as we talk about the future, I think that there is some reason to be encouraged in that we actually saw some major legislation passed this year. I mean, who would have ever thought the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act was passed, and so we are going to be looking at that extremely carefully to make sure that what was intended in the legislation happens. So I think that we should all be excited that the state funding is supposed to be focused 75% instead of 30% on providing job training for individuals with multiple barriers to employment. So that means out of school and disconnected youth, people with contact with the criminal justice system. We know that's a big issue in our communities. Mature workers, people who need skills to remain competitive. So I think that that's good news for all of us who are working on the ground. We also have launched a community development financial institution, which is one of the things that we can do to help ourselves while we're waiting for, all of Mr. Conyers' colleagues to get themselves together. And that is to be able to make microloans in the community so that small businesses can grow. And one of the pieces that is so important to remember is that entrepreneurship and small businesses are really where you see excellent numbers in terms of diversity hiring and also in hiring of ex-offenders. And I actually had a really interesting conversation just a week ago with a private sector partner who works for a large corporation and said, you all need to know that even though one of the great things the Obama administration did is release that EEOC guidance saying that because of the disproportionality in the criminal justice system, it may actually be a violation of civil rights law to ask people if they've been arrested on their job applications, because it's that bad. It could just be a proxy for race when you ask people if they've been arrested, but that's still not going to motivate big companies to hire people who have a practice. And so we were actually encouraged to focus even more of our attention on small businesses, and that big businesses can help by getting them into supplier diversity programs, but they're going to be the ones to do that hiring. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the Q&A.
No, definitely, thank you, Chanel. And I think that just leads into, because, one of the things of HR 1000 that's so important, and it discusses how important infrastructure is and how we can literally take dollars to build that infrastructure. I know, Tony, I know you have a tremendous background in this, and it's hard. So if you are talking to, and adding your own points as you see fit, but you are talking to Congress, and you are talking to Congress now, but in that process, you have to give us the elevator pitch to why this critical infrastructure is critical for catalyst for urban revitalization, job creation, and economic growth in our community. How would that pitch be met?
All right, let me show you.
Most definitely. Go on up here and get my notes out your way. Maya shut it down. Broke it down. She broke it. Got it.
Now back. First, I want to thank you, Congressman Conyers, for putting together this impressive panel. And I'm going to take a few minutes and kind of talk a little bit about the state of water and sewer infrastructure and how important it is across America and what an economic engine water utilities are across the country. I'm going to start with just a little quiz. How much money do you think we need to fix the nation's infrastructure? Anybody? $4.8 trillion. How many water breaks do you think we have across America on an annual basis? 240,000 water breaks on an annual basis. How many people do you think was out of water when there was a chemical spill in West Virginia earlier this year? 300,000 people without water. How many national disasters do you think we have on an annual basis? Or how many we had in 2013? 62. And a lot of that affected the infrastructure, and a lot of the federal funding that comes behind that to fix the infrastructure. And so, out in California, how many cities do you think are close to running out of water, drinking water? 17 cities in California alone are within 60 to 120 days of running out of drinking water. So that's why water and wastewater infrastructure is so important. And so about a year ago, I put together a panel of 30 utilities across America to start talking about the importance of water and wastewater infrastructure. And by the way, of those 30, representatives from Washington, D.C., Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, LA, Kansas City, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Cleveland. These are the cities that were part of this 30 group that we put together. And of course, only 2 of them look like me. So, but the problem is that when we talk about the infrastructure across America, we looked at what these cities are investing in infrastructure over the next 10 years. And according to the slide, if you look at it, we're investing $233 billion in operational and capital investments as utilities, as those 30 utilities over the next 10 years. That attributes to approximately $500 billion in U.S. economy, or at least national impact on the U.S. economy. $500 billion. And 2 weeks ago, we released a national economic report to Congress. And we presented that, we did a press conference on Capitol Hill, and we're trying to raise awareness on the importance of infrastructure, water and wastewater, as it relates to national economic power and also job creation. 290,000 jobs are sustained annually by the 30 utilities that are part of this national study. 290,000 jobs. You don't hear a lot about that, do you? 290,000 jobs. And a lot of the work that we're doing is in urban core communities across America. So that's why I think it's very important that we understand the impact of the study that we've released and the information that is available on the study. But when you think about where that money is being spent, part of it is being spent on capital infrastructure, some of it is being built on the operation of the utilities that we do every day. So when you think about how that trickles down, there are approximately $179 billion that are from direct work or direct projects that we do. And then there's $345 billion that is because of indirect and induced jobs that are created to support the contracts and the operations that we do as utilities. So again, that's $500 billion of economic impact that 30 water and sewer utilities across America mean to the national economic impact. So jobs, 87,000 direct jobs related to capital and operations. Again, 202,000 related to indirect and direct that support the jobs that we do directly as utilities. So as we think about that national perspective and we start to drill down to each city, what does that really mean? What it really means is, in terms of the ripple effect, when we talk about where are those jobs? Some of them are, again, with contracts, and some of them are with the utilities that we operate every day. And they are good jobs. They are jobs in maintenance and repair, the jobs in administration and customer service, jobs in production. All of that is available, and we need to do a better job of getting the word out to the communities that we serve about job availability. So one of the things that we're doing is trying to look at what are our needs and how do we make sure that the U.S. industry overall versus the U.S. industry overall. When you think about water agencies retiring by 2020 and wastewater agencies by 2020, you can kind of see how that compares to other U.S. industries. We have a need in water and wastewater to put people to work. And so how are we going to do that? We are building infrastructure as utilities for a lot of various reasons, and we are spending billions of dollars. The example in Cincinnati is that we are going to be spending $3 billion in wastewater infrastructure over the next 15 years. $3 billion, and that's just for infrastructure. And so when you think about that $3 billion, what does it really mean? We have challenges as we put those federal mandated programs in place. We're doing it because of a federal mandate. And because of that federal mandate, we have aging infrastructure, we have consent decrees, we have local economic conditions that are challenging, and we also have population reduction in some service areas that we serve. And so how do we make sure that we are balancing policy, balancing politics, the environment, and the economic impact of our local community so we don't bankrupt our cities? So the cities that we're talking about in Cincinnati facing the same challenges: plummeting property values, vacated properties, blight. So as we do these, how do we make sure that we're bringing value to the communities that we serve? So I have to know the economic condition of the communities that I serve. Unemployment across the city is averaging about 9%, but in disadvantaged communities, particularly in the African American communities, we're seeing unemployment at 30 to 40%. So as a utility manager, I have to recognize that, and I'm going to say, okay, as I start to deal with that infrastructure, how do I put people to work? And how do I recognize that when I build a project, I can also rebuild a community? So we are doing projects that are actually in the middle of the city, and we're doing projects that are going to create what I call community assets. Community assets that are going to revitalize neighborhoods, that are going to provide opportunities for communities to be put back to life, bringing back community assets that will create jobs and create private investments that will follow once the utility work is done. As you can see, these are the renderings of a project that we're doing in the middle of an urban community, and we think it's going to bring a lot of revitalization to the communities that we're serving. So our investments we're going to make, and by making those investments, we have to make sure that we're creating the factor conditions that are going to induce employment and investment after we do utility projects. So we have to make sure that our communities know about the job opportunities. We have to do projects that are going to support unemployment in our communities, and that's what we're doing in Cincinnati. And again, our role in Cincinnati is rolling up into the national report that really is talking about how do we make sure that everyone in America knows what water and wastewater economic engine is to the national economy. So that's a report that is available, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
So much for that. But that actually leads into my next panelist to give these thoughts, Jared Bernstein. And I guess, Jared, as you prepared this, I know you've written on the issue of how do we getting back to full employment, a better bargain for working people. And as you lead into that, you have to give your prepared remarks, but also as you're thinking of your remarks and giving them, think of this as well. I come across a lot of people across this country, a lot of urban centers, and I never will forget a young brother I met actually recently down in New Orleans. He had been unemployed for quite some time, and literally came to me and said, I feel like giving up. I feel like giving up. I don't feel human. And literally, I can see in his eyes that if I couldn't give him something that I would be lacking, I see that problem, because he had literally couldn't get a job. So how do we, from the moral side, but how do we get us back to a full employment status?
That's a great question. That's an alley-oop pass, because that's what I'm here to talk about. Yeah, well, okay, that's a problem, but thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with you, Congressman. Right back at you. Let me begin with an anecdote that is very much in the spirit of the story you just gave. I wasn't going to start this way, but your story reminded me of it. This book called Getting Back to Full Employment was actually my second book on the topic. My first one was written in the mid-90s. And I was thinking about this when I was on a tram in an airport in Chicago going between terminals. This is in the mid-90s, so this is pre-9/11, which is relevant. And these two guys who worked at the airport were, and you can tell they had a whole bunch of labels and badges on. They were going between terminals, and they were trying to figure out how they knew each other. So they worked at the airport, and they were going back and forth, a couple of young guys, and I was eavesdropping. It turned out they had met each other in prison. Now, you would be very hard-pressed to find, these were both minorities, to find two guys like that working in an airport unless the economy was really tightening up. So it started to give me a sense of the power of full employment. Now, you remember, everybody talks about Martin Luther King and the March on Washington, but that's just its nickname. The full name, as you well know, was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
Right.
And jobs came first. Because, as has been stated, there is a moral, a spiritual, and I'm going to emphasize a political dimension to this. Now, you've heard Maya and others talk about this, the fact that black unemployment is twice that of white. It's actually a little more than twice that of white, a little less than twice that of overall. But we can all get very unhappy about that fact, and the persistence of it is an extremely important and an extremely disturbing fact. It shouldn't be that way, and to my view, is unacceptable. But think about it this way. Turn that 2% over, and think about it in terms of a multiplier effect. So just have a little fun with numbers with me here. Suppose the overall unemployment rate falls from 7% to 5%. So that's a 2 percentage point decline. Just with this very simple arithmetic, that would imply that the unemployment rate for African Americans would fall from 14 to 10%, okay? If it were 7%, and we say that black unemployment is twice that of let's say this is white unemployment, so you'd be going from 7 to 5 overall, but for African Americans, you'd be going from 14 down to 10. That's a 4% decline in unemployment. So it's a doubling of the impact. My only point is this. You know, they say when the economy sniffles, black people catch a cold. I understand that. But when the economy begins to heal and strengthens and we move toward full employment, my work in tandem with Dean Baker and other economists shows that in fact the least advantaged get the biggest boost. So it is not an accident that Martin Luther King was thinking about jobs and full employment, and it's not an accident that the person who registered H.R. 1000 is Congressman Conyers, because that implication there is obviously very negative on the downside. I don't want to downplay that at all. The point about the depth of black unemployment and poverty is of course essential, and everyone here knows it, but remember, that also implies disproportionate gains as we move towards full employment. So, let me just take the rest of my few minutes here to talk about how we get there. Now what there is an interesting topic in and of itself. In the interest of time, I'm not going to speak to it, but it's critically important. And I suspect Professor Harvey will share some of this information with us. Because if I talk to, say, Representative Paul Ryan or someone from the other caucus, and you say, well, how do you get to full employment? They'd say, oh, well, we like full employment just as much as you, and that's why we got to cut taxes on rich people. So how you get from here to there is very important. People have talked about, you've heard a very, I thought, important discussion of infrastructure, but you can't do infrastructure, at least on the public side, unless you have better fiscal policy. So there has to be a fiscal policy component. I believe monetary policy plays a role. We can talk about that if you want, but we very much have established the Federal Reserve as a lender of last resort. When credit markets tighten up, that's widely accepted among people of all stripes and political persuasions. Well, what about government as an employer of last resort? If the credit markets fail to do their job, the Federal Reserve steps in and fills the gap. But if the private sector economy fails in its essential need to produce the quantity and the quality of the jobs we need for everybody, that's a market failure as well. And there's a role for government as the employer of last resort in ways that I'm happy to speak to. I have other examples I'll get into in Q&A if you want, but how we get there is, you can't just want to get there, you have to want to get there the right way. So let me end with a discussion of the politics, because we're not going to get there with today's politics, I'm afraid. I'm going to nod from Congressman Conyers, not that I need to tell any of you that, but we're not going to get there with today's politics. So I'm glad you have 57 co-sponsors. I think you should have 457 co-sponsors. So I'd like to talk about how we're going to get there. I'm an economist, not a political scientist or a politician, so I'm going to be brief. I don't want to stay too far out of my lane. But I do notice the following. I spend a lot of times in meetings with people thinking about this, including all yesterday afternoon. I think it was yesterday. It might have been the day before. It was the day before. I'm losing track. And I hear people talking, a lot of Democrats talking about RAE. Talking about the RAEs, the RAEs, the RAE. And I didn't know what the RAEs were, but they kept talking about the RAEs as something that was really important for Democrats, really great for Democrats. What does RAE stand for? Rising American Electorate. This is the demographic advantage that many Democratic politicians believe they have simply by dint of the demographics of the nation. If you're young, if you're minority, African American, Hispanic, right now you're about 53% of the electorate, and you're going to be more than that. And what I think is unfortunate and dangerous and ill-advised is that it is not acceptable for Democratic candidates to assume that they have the votes strictly based on demographics alone. You know, I play basketball. I can't do it dunk, but I do play basketball. I mean, and I still play every week. And there's a little trick called fake left, go right. If you want our support, and I'm clearly not a member of the RAE, but if you are, and if you want our support, you got to be for full employment. I need to hear you talk about full employment in a convincing way, to articulate the kinds of measures that are in HR 1000, to talk about the government as an employer of last resort. You don't have to talk about it that way. To talk about, but you do have to talk about the market. You do have to talk about the way the market fails, even in the best of times, to create adequate employment, whether it's quantity or quality, as we've heard, for less advantaged folks. And there's got to be a plan for infrastructure investment. There's got to be a smart plan for direct job creation, for fiscal policy. There's got to be a smart plan for the kinds of labor standards, like higher minimum wages. There's got to be apprenticeships and helping people overcome educational barriers. That's got to, the full employment, a convincing plan for full employment has to be a central plank in your platform. Don't assume that because I look a certain way, or I'm of a certain persuasion, or I'm a certain age, that I'm going to vote for you automatically. Give me a good reason to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to jump right to Mr. Bird. I'm actually going to jump to you on this one. I'm just going to hop a little bit coming back. But I think actually what was led into on that was the March on Washington. I know you are the political analyst with youth policy at Claflin. So what I really want to get into is this, and we share the same space. Folks we work with. Before us in the room, I want to say, we have Congressman Conyers here, who has been one of America's most important leaders of the civil rights movement, MLK holiday movement, anti-apartheid movement, and most recently the father of universal single payer and the very successful leader of the movement for universal health care, and now Jobs for All. He sits here, and we just heard about the March on Washington, about how that was one of the key things with Dr. King when he was allowed in the civil rights movement 50 years ago in '64. The question now becomes for us is that we know that young people of color are the most affected who don't have jobs. But then how can we get them and how can we get that to become one of the top issues for our generation to understand that while it is important that we deal with issues from Trayvon to Mike Brown to Oscar Grant, we deal with issues regarding schools and including our HBCUs. But if we don't have jobs for young people, if we don't have jobs for our community, how do we get to the point where they're ready again to march for Jobs for All? How do we get to that moment?
Good question. Well, let me just begin by thanking Representative Conyers for his dedication and leadership on the issue of jobs, but more importantly, really looking at the youth jobs issue and the jobs of long-term unemployed. A lot of times people forget when we're talking about direct job creation that many of our young people are not yet prepared and are still being left behind in our communities. So I'm going to give us a couple quick points. I know that we all know a lot of the, the bad statistics and so forth, but I think it's always important just to rattle off a few of them so we can keep them front of mind. And I'll begin with a story. A couple of years ago at class, we went around the country talking to young Black and Latino men who were getting reconnected to their education and also jobs and employment through some local strategies. And we wanted to know, what were your challenges? What were your barriers? What were you most aspiring to be, to look forward to? They were between 18 and 24. And one young man in Baltimore in particular just really stands out in my mind. And a couple of things he said. One is that whether he was in foster care growing up, he was homeless, he had been in the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system. He got an opportunity to earn and learn through a civic works program, which is a quasi-publicly funded program. But what he said to me is what is his chief barrier is work experience. He said all the things that he has gone through, he did not say his criminal history, he did not say housing and so forth. He said, I don't have an opportunity to have work experience, and through this program he did. And so when we think about how do we get young people, back into the fold, we have to think about what are the ways in which we create work experience for low income and poor communities. The poverty data came out last week, and what we know is that the young adults 18 to 24 and in deep poverty are the largest population group besides young children who are living in deep poverty. So our young adults are suffering. They're disproportionately, minority or people of color. And actually, for this age group, it grows for African Americans. It remained about roughly the same, but it grows about 1.7% or so forth. So there is a persistent and now growing inequality and problem in our communities. We also know that they're young parents, they're single parents, and they're raising other young children. So our solutions have to be comprehensive, they have to be holistic. They can't just be about the young person, but they have to be about the whole family. So as we think about direct job creation, I really enjoyed the presentation from our fellow panelists here from Cincinnati, because as he's thinking about infrastructure, he's also thinking about how do you build community and so forth. The other thing that we know in terms of employment, and Chanel talked about this, Jared talked about this, is that youth unemployment is also about double the rate of adult unemployment. So it's historically going to be higher than adults over 25. And then for young people of color, it's going to be about double than their white counterparts, in particular for African Americans. You disaggregate that by race and gender, and we have a black male youth issue. I don't want to say problem, but we have an issue that we need to address. And when we know, my grandmother used to say, idle hands is the devil's playground. But the young men that I meet, even when they have all these challenges, they want to be reconnected. They don't have an opportunity to be reconnected. I live right here in Northeast Washington, D.C. And I talk to young men every day when I get off the X2. And I ask, a couple of the young brothers, so what'd you do today? Oh, sis, I can't get a job. Can you help me? What can you do? And these are young men that, for the most part, society has written off. Our leadership has written off. Our communities have written off. People they ignore them. They walk by and don't speak to them. So I'm not here to say what we individually can do, because we all have a job to do individually. But what can we do in terms of public policy? There's a couple of things. And in addition to HR 1000, Representative Conyers with Senator Sanders has also introduced the Employee Young Americans Act. And so when we think about direct employment, we also have to think about the strategies, the on-ramps, the pipelines. Apprenticeships are important, but our young people need pre-apprenticeships to even get there. We have to think about direct, concentrated strategies that help this 16 to 24 population. If we don't, we're going to be really setting back our communities 10, 20, 30 years moving forward. Again, as what did you call it? RAEs are growing the population of electorate. They're also the fastest growing populations for our labor market, for our future labor force. If they're uneducated, they don't have opportunities to gain early work experience. How many folks here had a summer job? And how old were you when you had your summer job? 14 or 15? Your first job. These are young people we are meeting who are going up until they're about 21, 22, and they've never had work experience. The person I'm from Philadelphia, my first job was with Philajob. It was some federally funded summer jobs program. And these are the kind of opportunities we have to create, and in part that bill does that. But leave with one point that I think is very important that we have to remember, and Chanel talked about it. We owe it. The Workforce Investment and Opportunities Act is critically important. Over the next year, while people in the Department of Labor, Department of Education, HHS are going to be writing regulations, communities need to be prepared on the ground to understand what this bill could potentially do in your state and local community. There's a lot of maze in there and not shells. But as local activists, as well as local workforce administrators, I better understand what's in there. One, it redirects funding to this particular population. Chanel mentioned that 75% of youth formula funds have to be spent on out-of-school youth. How are they going to innovate, create pathways, pipelines, connected to other infrastructure opportunities in your community? They also have to, there's a lot of language in there about career pathways. How are states and local communities going to create opportunities for individuals with barriers to employment? And so just want to end with that, and the class is actually going to be putting out an analysis of this, and we're going to be working with state, local community advocates to help realize the full potential of the law. It's not new money, but it's new ways of thinking how we rebuild the infrastructure that needs to support our communities.
No, thank you so much, Brad. Thank you. I want to jump back to Valerie Wilson, because I wanted to come back to the policy piece, the policy questions around all of the heard so far. And I also want to add this, and please give your remarks as you want to give them, but I want to add this, and actually this is something that for me and Councilman Conyers have written articles together on a number of things from justice and climate change and so he's on the right, I just want to name on the article, that kind of stuff. And I'm going to ask him this question later actually, because the one thing that gets me, I'm a young person, maybe I don't quite get it yet, and Chanel, you can help me with this too, is that for me, I look at myself as human. I'm black, but I'm human, right? And I'm also progressive. So I should think that we should be as progressive. We should be black, white, brown, yellow, red, male, female, straight, gay, theist, atheist. We should be together as humans, right? Trying to get jobs for all. And then what blows my mind, though, is that those who should be on my side, progressives who should be on my side, the minute I mention race, and I don't know what it is, but for some reason, race is the tripwire for the progressive movement. And so I get to that race issue around policy and show the facts. The whole thing, they fall and leave. Funders don't fund it. Other orgs don't, they just leave. And so how do we take this analysis and coach it so that even our friends in Congress, I know Congressman Congress, even our friends, those who are also progressives, that they can understand the magnitude of what it means to have a job for our community.
Reverend Euro, that's a powerful question, and I feel that it's an appropriate question for me. I've been at EPI, which is a progressive think tank here in DC, for only about 6 months now. But before I came to EPI, I worked at the National Urban League. As our VP of Research there at the National Urban League. So I definitely bring both of those perspectives together. And I think, Jared talked about the RAE. I think, a lot of discussion going on now in society is about income inequality, which tends to be more of a class issue, something that the progressive movement has really taken on. But I think as we look at how the demographics of our population are shifting, together with the trends that we've seen in income inequality, wage inequality, there's really a great opportunity to begin to address the issues that you raised in a more constructive and a more productive way. We know that class inequality and race inequality intersect and overlap on many levels. And so just as you mentioned, I think a lot of the tactics that have been used to push back policies that would favor the working class. So for example, fight against raising the minimum wage, the attack on unions and weakening collective bargaining power. A lot of the groups that attack those things are the same groups that are in support of voter suppression tactics, things that lie squarely within the civil rights movement and other sort of more racially focused organizations. And so I think the sooner that we can recognize that there's a common enemy and that victory for any of us will mean that we have to really begin to unify and work together and build strength in numbers, I think the more opportunity there will be to begin to tackle some of these long-standing issues. So I'm working now on a research paper. I actually just finished writing it. It should be coming out soon. On working on some projections, and just to make that point and put some numbers behind it, I developed some projections on when the working class, which are people, loosely identifying as people with less than a bachelor's degree, will become majority minority. We know that census has said the overall population will transition in 2043. I'm projecting that for this working class population, that's going to happen about 10, 11 years before then. And so it's incumbent upon us now to recognize that that's coming, to recognize that the attacks against the labor movement, civil rights organizations, racial minorities, immigrants are all really coming from the same place, and band together to push against those, but also to fight for the kind of investments we need so that as Keisha just explained, so that the workforce that is coming up, these young people who are going to be the working age population 30 years from now or so that they are prepared. And what that means is that we're building a stronger economy. We can no longer have this paradigm of greed and inequality and benefiting some groups in our society, benefiting on the backs of others. We really do have to see ourselves as one nation, like we say in the pledge, one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. That's really what that's about. And so, I wasn't planning to talk about all of that, but so that's my response to your question, because that really did strike me. The other point that I was planning to make, Maya spoke very eloquently about the racial and ethnic wealth gap. She talked about how that's related to racial and ethnic income gaps. We've heard people talk about disparities in poverty rates. Behind all of that is wage inequality. Because the fact is that most people in this country get income from what they make on their job. And so, the same way that we've seen income inequality grow over the last 35 years or so, we've seen wage inequality grow over the last 35 years or so. So, since 1979, inflation-adjusted wages for the vast majority of Americans have been flat. They haven't gone anywhere. That's not to say that our economy hasn't been more productive. Productivity has continued to grow. But most of the gains from that economic growth have gone to just a small sliver of individuals at the top. So again, this is another opportunity to recognize that we have more in common with each other than not. And so what that has meant, at the same time that we've seen growing inequality in wages by class, if you will, we've also seen racial wage gaps widening. So in 1979, the median black worker earned about 83 cents for every dollar of the median white worker. In 2013, that's down to 77 cents on the dollar. Similar pattern for Latino workers, from 81 cents on the dollar in 79 down to just about 69 cents on the dollar in 2013. Now, education is often proposed as a way to boost wages, boost employment, and it is. If you have a higher level of education, you're going to have a lower unemployment rate than someone with less education. You're more than likely going to make more. Your wages are going to be higher than someone with less education. But more education gets blacks higher wages. It doesn't necessarily get them equal wages relative to whites. And so if we look at, and so just to, again, put some numbers on this, if we look at, say, that highest sliver of wage earners in our society, so say the top, those in that 95th percentile, where black and white workers are just as likely to have a college degree, about 80% of both groups have a college degree, but the wage gap among that group is still 70 cents on the dollar. So education doesn't close racial wage gaps. It gets you higher wages, doesn't necessarily get you equal wages. So in looking at that, and what are some of the policy solutions to these problems? First of all, given that, like I said at the beginning, class inequality, racial inequality overlap. Minorities are disproportionately at the bottom of the income distribution, the wage distribution, the wealth distribution. You know, we've seen all of that. So any sort of policy that's in favor of promoting and creating good family-supporting jobs are going to be policies that would disproportionately benefit African Americans and Latinos. So that includes raising the minimum wage that you've already heard about, updating overtime rules, which is something that's currently being discussed by the Department of Labor, as well as issues like work scheduling standards, this sort of just-in-time policy where people can be called into work at a moment's notice or don't, have any certainty with what their work schedule is going to be, is very limiting in terms of one's ability to be able to plan and prepare. If you wanted to get an additional part-time job to support the low wages that you're making on one, it's very difficult to do that if you never have any idea of when you're going to be required to be at work. So that's an issue. And then, there are various forms of wage theft, people being paid under the table and off the books, etc. So in addition to these kinds of policies, though, and we've heard about infrastructure investment that disproportionately benefits African American communities. In terms of addressing those racial gaps, there are some very specific things that we need to address in that area as well. One being the issue of occupational segregation. That there are certain occupations that are almost exclusively Black women, some are almost exclusively Latino women, and so on and so forth. On the face of it, maybe that wouldn't be such a big problem if those weren't also occupations where people tended to be paid the least. So, valuing work at all levels of income, all levels of effort is something that's very important to closing those disparities. And then we look at persistent unemployment disparities and addressing discrimination in hiring, promotion, and pay. Again, that gets us beyond just sort of moving up the scale and beginning to bring racial disparities.
And when will the report come out?
It will probably be out early next month.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll have to look at that. Thank you so much. That's very important information. Good job for Valerie. I want to make sure that two things, and then we're going to have Professor Harvey, then I definitely want to have Cousin Conyers give some of the closing remarks, and then we're going to have some different pieces. Professor Harvey, you have to bring us home here. Please give us a presentation actually on Congressman Conyers' full employment bill, HR 1000.
Okay, I have a handout that some of you have because I distributed some earlier, and there are plenty of copies on the table that has all of the slides for my presentation so that you can take home what I've tried to convey to you today. My job is to explain to you how HR 1000 would work and why it would change the world as we know it, because indeed it would do that. I'm going to begin with funding. The Act, if enacted, would establish 2 trust funds for the purpose of job creation. So just as we now have a trust fund to pay for Social Security benefits and a trust fund to pay for unemployment insurance benefits, we would have trust funds to pay for job creation and job training. And 67% of the funding that the Act would provide would go into the Job Creation Trust Fund, 33%, the rest of it would go into the Job Training Trust Fund. But the Job Training Trust Fund has attached to it a mandate that job training programs, wherever appropriate, be paid job training programs, so that they would include a stipend. They would be a job, simply a job, learning how to do some other job. So that while the trust funds are divided between job training and job creation, I think it's important to understand that the job training component is in and of itself also a job creation component. The funding for both of these trust funds would come from a financial transactions tax. That's a tax on trades of stocks and bonds and derivatives and all of those sorts of things. It would generate approximately $110 to $220 billion a year. We don't know how much, because it depends on how many such transactions occurred in a year, which varies with the state of the economy, and also the fact that these transactions are taxed could have some effect on how many of them occur. But we estimate that it would produce revenue in that level. The retirement accounts that many of us have, and hope all workers should have, are exempt from the financial transactions tax, so that retirement funds would not be depleted as a result of the funding of the trust funds. The trust funds would also be empowered to borrow additional money directly from the Federal Reserve System whenever it was needed, whenever the trust funds themselves did not have enough money to prevent the unemployment rate from increasing 1 point in a year. They would be empowered, and the Federal Reserve System would be directed to lend the trust funds the additional money needed to keep that unemployment rate stable without having to go to Congress for permission. Very, very important feature. The borrowed funds would be repaid over a 10-year period, which over a long period of time is about what an average business cycle takes. So the idea is that if you need extra money to pay for the unemployment associated with a recession, you'll have until the next recession hits to pay it back. Trust fund monies would be released for funded jobs and training slots whenever the Bureau of Labor Statistics says there is unemployment in the country. Okay? That is a fancy lawyerly way of saying always. Okay? There would always be money available for job creation projects. The constraint would not be the availability of money. The limitation would be, well, how many jobs do we need to provide work for everybody who does not have one? To be eligible for one of these jobs, you would have to register with your state employment service as available for work. And if you were unemployed and receiving UI benefits, you would be immediately eligible for one of the jobs. If you were unemployed but were not receiving UI benefits and had searched for work with the assistance of the employment service for 30 days if you were a disadvantaged person, or 60 days if you were not, then you would be eligible for a job. So the idea is if after a reasonable period of assisted search it appears there are no jobs out there for you, suitable for you, then the program provides you a job. And if you're employed part-time but want full-time work, you also have eligibility for a program job after a 13-week assisted search process with the help of the State Employment Service. Eligible job creation projects would be funded through state and local governments and Indian tribes, but the projects themselves could be administered by whatever agencies the state government, local government, Indian tribes approved for the operation of projects. So it could be not-for-profit organizations, it could be the government itself, agencies of the government. It could even be a for-profit corporation for that matter. Well, actually, I think there is a provision that says they have to be not-for-profit. Okay, not-for-profit agencies, I think that is written in. Okay, the projects have to be designed to, quote, address community needs, et cetera, et cetera. Grant recipients, that is, the agencies that are creating the jobs, are required to consult with community leaders, including labor organizations and other relevant organizations in planning and designing projects. At least 80% of the funding from the program for a project has to be devoted to direct labor costs, providing for wages and benefits as opposed to materials and supplies. That doesn't mean, though, that the project would necessarily be limited to those with that fairly constrained resource requirement. It just means that if there were a project that needed more concrete and steel and lumber than that provided for, there would be a need for supplemental funding. So if you wanted to build houses and you had some mortgage financing to support the project, in addition to the program funding, the program will pay for the jobs and you can pay for some other costs from other ways. So even very heavily capital-intensive projects, the water projects that we were hearing there is such a desperate need of, could be funded with the assistance of the program, provided some supplemental funding source was available. And at least 35% of the persons employed on a project must qualify as disadvantaged. And any revenue generated by a project has to be used to support the project. And that actually increases the job creation potential of the entire program, because it's not in fact limited to its own allocated funding from the trust funds, but if, for instance, housing were built and you didn't decide to give it away for free, but actually, made people pay some rent for it, then that revenue would increase your job-creating capacity. The job requirements, the jobs have to last for, let me say one other thing. After an person obtains a job on a project, they still have to maintain their registration with the State Employment Service as available for work. And I'll come back to this point later on and explain why it's so important. They still remain available for work as though they were unemployed. Okay? But while they are waiting for a job to become available for them, they don't have to sit and do nothing and earn nothing. They can work in a good job, providing useful services to the community, but they remain available for work, and I'll come back to why that's an important feature. Will this be sufficient to achieve full employment? Well, the funding available from the taxes that are designated for it should be sufficient to create about 3 to 6 million jobs a year, including paid training slots. And that should be enough to achieve full employment at the top of the business cycle. And by that I mean if the unemployment rate is at 4%. Now, many economists refer to that as 4%, which is as full employment, which is fine, but it's important to understand that when full employment is used to describe 4% unemployment or 5% unemployment, it doesn't mean that there are enough jobs to provide work for everybody who wants it. It just means that's as low as we can get the unemployment rate through the process of economic growth. That's as good as the economy can do without generating unacceptable rates of inflation. What the program that HR 1000 would create is designed in part to do is to get past that point and create a mechanism that would allow us to weed out the other 2 or 2.5 percentage points of unemployment that still exist, so that we can have an economy that provides a job, enough jobs available for everyone who wants to work. And we know that is between 1 and 2% unemployment, or translates into that, because when jobs really are plentiful in a particular community or local labor market or country, even today, that's where unemployment rates go. So if we can get the economy functioning well enough to get to the 4% level, then this program would get us down to the genuine full employment level of 2% or less. But the program would also be tremendously helpful in getting us to the 4%, because it would, among other things, while providing jobs, also provide a stimulus to the economy the way other government spending programs do. Okay. With unemployment currently at the 6.1% level, if HR 1000 were enacted today, I think that it is reasonable to expect that within 2 to 3 years, we would have unemployment down to the 2% level, and we could maintain it at that level permanently. Because remember, the money is there to provide jobs for anybody who needs work for whom a job is not otherwise available. And there would be sufficient funds to ensure that those jobs remained available in sufficient number to provide work for everybody who wants it, and if that were the state of the labor market, that's where we have unemployment. Why does it have such a powerful job creation effect? The reason HR 1000 creates more jobs, and if you look at the numbers closely and compare it to the job creation potential of some other kinds of investments, you'll see HR 1000 creates a lot more jobs per dollar of money. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but the most important one is that it combines the job creation effect of an economic stimulus, of the government spending money, with its own direct job creation effect. Think of the unemployment insurance program. Everybody knows that when the government spends money on unemployment insurance, it stimulates the economy when the people who receive the benefits spend them. And that helps to create jobs. So what do you get for unemployment insurance? You get a bunch of people who are receiving a benefit equal to about half of their former wage, but they're not employed, and and economic stimulus. Well, if the unemployment part, if the benefit part of the program wasn't a benefit at half your wage while you don't work, but a job that pays you your full wage, you still get the stimulus effect on private employment, and you get the directly created jobs. Instead of beneficiaries of unemployment insurance benefits, you have employees of the HR 1000 job creation program. Okay? And let me go quickly. Why not inflationary? How is it that this strategy for creating jobs could help us get past that barrier? Because we all know, it was the national unemployment rate was like 4% or less when Watts blew up in the 60s. Just because the unemployment rate reaches 4% doesn't mean that, especially in communities of color, there is jobs enough for everybody who needs them. How can HR 1000 overcome that problem? Because when it reaches 4%, the federal government, the Federal Reserve, is going to be putting on the brakes. They're going to be trying to stop the economy from growing further, to prevent the unemployment rate from going lower. So we've got to have some other mechanism to blow past that 4% barrier and get it down to where jobs are available for everybody who wants them. Well, why can HR 1000 do that? First, you can add to demand, you can add to job creation at the top of the business cycle without adding to aggregate demand in the economy. Why? It's because of this trust fund mechanism. You collect more taxes, take more demand out of the economy than it costs you to provide the jobs. That's why unemployment insurance is referred to by economists as an automatic stabilizer. Because at the top of the business cycle, more money is taken out of the economy than is spent in benefits. And then during recession, you spend more in benefits than you take it in taxes. Okay? Well, this is the kind of program that would do exactly the same thing by creating jobs. So it's an automatic stabilizer which would create the jobs without adding to aggregate demand at the top of the business cycle, or at least it could be funded in a way that had that effect. Secondly, the job creation effect can be targeted in a way that it is very hard to do with general economic stimuli. When the unemployment rate is 4%, it's an average. And we know in some places, when it's 4%, it'll be 2%. Other places, communities of color, it'll be 8%. Well, the problem with general economic stimulus is they tend to go where the money is. They tend to overstimulate the parts of the economy where, in fact, there's already a shortage of jobs, and the money never gets to the communities where the jobs are really needed. It only slowly gets to them. HR 1000 would limit its job creation effect to places where there is unemployment, and that would help reduce any inflationary effect of the job creation. And third, because the program employees remain available for work, they are what economists sometimes refer to as a buffer stock. You put oil down in the ground so that when the price is up, you can get it back out of the ground, put it in the market, and it keeps the price from going up. Well, labor in a program like this, if it remains available for private sector employment, if and when jobs become available, would have the same kind of buffer stock effect. In fact, that's why unemployment keeps prices down. It's because those workers who are unemployed, because they're available for work, provide a competitive barrier to price increases. And a program like this would do the same thing without requiring that anybody suffer unemployment. So you can have the benefits of unemployment without paying the cost of it. So I think that and I've got a couple more slides, but I know that my time is up, so I'm going to stop at this point. Happy to answer any further questions.
When we come to the close, I want to do two things. One, I know, because I'm a political scientist, so I understand that sometimes we get all the information. I have an opportunity, the panel, if you can, people can come up and ask specific questions at the end of the session that we have. This is a very policy-oriented discussion. But if you have a burning question right now before Councilman Collier was closing this out, that means you have a burning question, that we all need to hear. Come on now, after Bernie, it's a Bernie question. So go ahead, this is
I may be taking a contrarian position. And I also acknowledge that this might sound like an intro economics question. There's a company that just came out, it's called Momentum Machines. It can make hamburgers 400 an hour. It does not have to stop. It's interesting that this has happened at the same time that we're involved in the fight for 15. So my question to you is this: how do we reconcile the increasing comparative cost of labor with the declining comparative value of labor? I say that as an attorney who represents restaurants. I can hire people and have to negotiate dealing with things like the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Affordable Care Act, or I can advise the guy, buy a machine, don't hire anybody.
Thank you so much. Does anybody want to take that on?
I'll jump in, but maybe others, Valerie, I'll try to be quick. It's a great question. I have a few answers for you. First of all, if in fact the increase in the minimum wage led to an increase in labor-saving technology and investments in the kind of technology that replaced workers, we would see a correlation between higher minimum wages and diminished employment. We simply don't see that in the data. The increases in the minimum wage, even though the textbooks and the theory say they should lead to large job losses, they simply don't. So empirically, there's not much evidence for what you're saying. Secondly, there is while there's a great deal of concern about the acceleration of labor-saving technology replacing jobs that's kind of behind, the robots are taking over, there's little evidence for that as well. Thirdly, it's actually, when I have debates over the minimum wage and someone raises this, I often think, to some extent, the argument, I know you don't mean this, or I'm going to assume you don't mean this, the argument is someone will say, well, why can't we be more like Mexico or some country that essentially incentivizes the hiring and use of the lowest wage labor instead of capital investment, instead of more investments in technology and more efficient ways to produce. I don't think we should be be concerned in a technologically advanced economy like ours if employers want to substitute technology for work. It's been going on ever since the very beginning of time. And yet, we still have robust periods of economic growth and high employment. So I don't believe that there is the trade-off that is suggested in the question, either empirically or historically.
Thank you so much. So for the last two questions here, I want to make sure there comes kind of his time to give his closing remarks. So please give a brief question and go from there. Go ahead.
My name is Joseph Bescott, and I am representing I'm advocating for American Association for Tax Cut. We represent cab driver nationwide. And there is a nationwide problem. If government requires you to have a professional license in order to practice your profession, that's the case of an attorney, you need a bar license before you practice law. If you are a real estate agent, you need a real estate license. A teacher in the teaching license, a truck driver in the CDL license. Once you finish off that license, you have two choices. You can work for someone or you can work for yourself. If you decide to work for yourself, you need an occupational license for a permit for your business. Most jurisdictions, like New York City, Miami, Florida, Los Angeles, California, Chicago, Illinois, they deny cab driver an occupational license for their business. Instead, those jurisdictions, those cities, they give the cab driver a list of companies. They say, go to those companies. If they have licensed vehicles, you can work for them. Which make the driver end up paying 3/4 of what they make. And they make way below poverty level, $15,000-$20,000.
No, thank you.
Oh, can you help us? We have a proposed bill on our website, which is www.myaatc.org. You go and create campaign, bill to Congress. How can you help us? Can you help us, Black Caucus, try to turn this proposed bill into law? Because Congress make a mistake. Congress said that Department of Transportation.
Let me-
Let's try to answer that.
Yeah. Thank you, no. Thank you. Go ahead.
So I would just say thank you for raising that issue. I mean, that is an example of something where there's a policy that is driving something that, disadvantages.
87%. In New York City, 87% of cab drivers are minorities. Black, Hispanic, Middle Eastern, and third generation American citizens. So if there is something that could be done, make the unemployment down, Congress must deregulate the entire taxi industry nationwide and make place to all those companies like Uber, Lyft, they must comply with the law.
Well, let me say this.
Vehicle must be licensed.
Well, let me say this, thank you. Just so I have enough time. And I have the panel, let me hold that. I know you want to respond to that. Thank you, there's so much we have time for the Congressman. And we'll definitely, after the panel, it's a very intricate, layered question, different things, new technology, new businesses, merging together old businesses. So definitely need to have that question after the panel. My sister from Detroit, quickly.
Yes, thank you for this distinguished panel and the information that was presented. I am Kimberly Hildott from Detroiters, working for the Environmental Justice and the Director of Policy there. And I'm really interested in the legislation because we have an apprenticeship program that really focuses on the most vulnerable communities, those who are really hard to place, particularly ex-offenders, those without, a high school degree and the like. And I'm very interested in the job training portion of this particular bill. I see that 33% will be allocated towards paid stipends, and I'm wondering if that number can either be increased or if it can be included in this to also cover the instructors, which is a major part of the job training programs. And additionally, Congressman Conyers, I think that you will probably have a lot of support for this legislation. As you may know, there is a growing movement of community benefit advocates in the city of Detroit around the bridge, around the new stadium that's being built, and a lot of other development projects.
Thank you. Professor Harvey, quickly.
Yeah, the answer is yes. Clearly, the funding would provide for instructors as well. It's funding for the program, not just for the salaries of the recipients. And as to whether the 67-33% split is the right split, that's something we'll learn with experience. And because the distinction between training and working is going to be fuzzed by the program, a lot of on-the-job training, it's a thing that can be adjusted without necessarily changing the statutory allocation of funds by having projects that combine funding from both sources in one program.
Thank you so much. Folks, I'm going to ask, we're going to give it for our panel, please. They were a phenomenal panel. There's Congressman Conyers, Professor Harvey, use your phone. As Congressman Conyers is here, I just wanted to say this. I got a note here, as you, Congressman Conyers, from Conyers have been in office, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, George Bush Jr., and Barack Obama.
Come on, man.
My favorite staffers up front here, but one of the staffers who was in his office, Rosa Parks.
Come on, man.
That's the magnitude of the man that's here.
That's right.
So I want you to understand that and understand what God gave us, because God don't give us these kind of jewels too often. Councilman Conyers.
Well, that's a great recitation, except when I met John Kennedy, I was not in Congress. I started with Lyndon Johnson. But thank you anyway. Folks, I just wanted to point out that we have not talked about young people. And a few days ago, Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, and I introduced the very same bill in mine in the House, H.R. 5489, and his in the Senate, to provide $5.5 billion in immediate funding to state and localities to employ 1 million young Americans between the ages of 16 and 24 for job training for other young people. And we introduced the bill because nearly 15% of all of the 16 to 24-year-olds are neither in a classroom or a workplace. And so it's time for us to remember those young folks, this great generation, and I want you to know that we aren't leaving them out of the struggle for full employment in America. Thank you very much.
And that concludes, and I do want to just mention one thing, Councilman Carter, that Councilman Carter was the only politician who was endorsed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you all.